The first thing I should say is that I'm not an academic, and therefore am more than a little nervous to be in such a esteemed company today. I work for a think tank. Think tanks are more like magpies, shall we say. So we see shiny things and we pick them up and we steal them and we use them to build our nests. So I'm going to talk to you about something, an array of shiny things that we've stolen and included in a project pamphlet that we launched just before Christmas, which was called A Place for Pride, which was talking about why, in our view, patriotism can be a positive, binding and important feature of national political discourse, and why it is something that is overlooked at our peril. I'm going to dwell, that report talked about a whole series of different things about patriotism. I'm going to dwell, as the somewhat pretentious title of my presentation suggests, I'm going to dwell on one particular aspect, which is some of the positive correlations between feelings of patriotism and pride and certain behaviours and instincts and attitudes. Now, it's important, and let's crack on. Let's try and do that. So, this is the purpose of the project. I think it's kind of clear. We're not necessarily that interested in big arguments about whether patriotism is best rooted in England or in Britain or in Scotland. I know that Doug is watching me, waiting for me to confuse Britain and England and Scotland and to pounce, and as rightly he should. And the reason for that is because, I mean, the methodology of our project was that we, after a literature review, we were particularly interested in behavioural psychology and in emerging work in the US, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. A big poll of 2,000 British citizens, roughly spread across all of the parts of Great Britain, excluding Northern Ireland. We did exclude Northern Ireland on the basis that it opened up a set of issues which we had insufficient time, money and expertise to deal with, and focus groups. We ran a lot of focus groups, and what became very clear as we began doing our research is that what we were interested in actually was patriotism at a British level, and at an English or Scottish or Welsh level, and at a regional level, and at a city level. And that's because, and I should say this starting off, because it's a kind of normative point, and it's certainly where we come from on this, we don't necessarily accept the idea that any of these things are necessarily mutually exclusive to one another. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as well as we move on. So there is a question here, which I'm sure will have occurred to all of you, which is what is virtuous? And much as I would like to be able to say that I've decided what is virtuous and I know what is virtuous and everyone else ought to be like that, I think that would be somewhat unacceptable in the view and the minds of many. So what we've chosen is some relatively politically uncontroversial proxies of kind of the virtuous life in terms of people's attitudes and their behaviour. Volunteering, trust, cohesion and optimism are the proxies that we have chosen. And the reason we've chosen those is because they're things that all three political parties, albeit perhaps with slightly different normative takes on what each of these means, express as being goods. Doug?
Are there only three political parties, Max?
There are only three political parties in my head. I recognise there are many, many more. The SNP surely looks at all of these things and says these are good things, so I think we can. But there are, of course.
I just want you to expand the number.
There are. Well, I said Maine, where I come from. There are three main political parties, though. And in Britain as a whole, there are three main political parties. But I absolutely accept your point. And the reason that I wanted to point out that we were using three, although we can call it four or five and include Clyde, is that there are, of course, political parties for whom these things are not necessarily virtuous. There are political parties for whom cohesion is not something which one necessarily aspires to, and I'm going to be completely honest, we're excluding their notion of the virtuous from ours. So this is a quote from a focus group participant, because the other part of this equation is what is patriotism. And we found really early on in our focus groups that there was a certain amount of ambivalence about the word patriotism itself. And you can see here, it's a bit weird to be patriotic. Not because they're scared that they're going to suddenly become a member of the BNP if they admit to some love or pride in their country, but because it's perceived as being in some way detached from everyday experience. Lots of people talked about patriotism as being about people who go to the proms, or people who wave Union Jacks and get very, very excited in Windsor today to watch Her Majesty as she progresses past her troops. And they felt that wasn't really something which spoke to them. Now, I don't necessarily accept people's definition of patriotism in that way, but it was important, therefore, for us to try and find a different language for talking about it in order to try and get at people's sentiments about Britain and what they felt about Britain in terms of an investment in it. And for that reason, and because we felt there was a kind of language gap in terms of talking about patriotism, we talked about pride. And so in all of our polling questions, we asked people what they were proud of, what made them proud to be British, whether they were proud to be British. We didn't talk about patriotism per se. And using our polling, we were able, because we asked people a huge amount of questions about their activities, their attitudes, what they did in their daily lives, what they felt about people, and then we asked them a whole set of questions to kind of index them in terms of how patriotic they were, and there were some interesting correlations. And it's at this point that I have to concede something which academics in the room will certainly leap upon me for. When we say that there are correlations, I'm not claiming that we have proved that these things cause each other, and in fact the relationships are incredibly complex, as we'll go on to in a minute. But nonetheless, these are really interesting patterns around people's behaviour and how they match up to their level of patriotism. So when you control for people's socio-economic circumstances, etc., people who we identify as patriots, they're 15% less likely to never volunteer, and they're 10% more likely to volunteer regularly, by which we mean on a monthly basis. They're 20% more likely to trust fellow citizens, which speaks to our trust point. We also asked people, and this was a slightly controversial question, the polling company came back to us and said, do you really want to ask people this? We asked people whether or not they agreed with the statement that people who aren't British are generally trustworthy. Lots of people ask about whether your neighbours are trustworthy on the whole, or whether people in your community are not trustworthy on the whole. We asked about whether people who were non-British were generally trustworthy. And here is, I think, an interesting and perhaps counterintuitive in terms of lots of political narrative and political worry about patriotism. Patriots are actually 15% more likely to believe that non-British people here in the UK are generally trustworthy. So the idea that being a patriot somehow renders you more open and susceptible to feelings of xenophobia and feelings of exclusion, I think needs some challenging. And patriots also, incredibly unsurprisingly, are more likely to be optimistic about Britain's future and optimistic about their own future. We talk about the circle of pride, to use it almost sounds Lion King-ish. And this speaks to what I was trying to kind of get at earlier about it not really mattering whether you feel very proud to be Scottish and also very proud to be British, that these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although obviously for some people they are. But on the whole, in terms of the pattern of the polling, people who have pride in what we call the public personal, so things about you that are visible, so your family, your house, etc., are more likely to have pride in their community and are more likely to have pride in their kind of broader social networks. And those people, unsurprisingly, are the most likely to feel patriotic about Britain as a whole. And that makes, I think, a lot of sense as a story in terms of a progression of pride from the individual out. Philip Blond uses what I'm sure is a phrase hijacked from somewhere else, but it nonetheless, I think, sums this up beautifully, which is that it's through kind of loving the particular that we learn to love the universal. And I think that for, in terms of the conversation about patriotism, we have to understand it as a point in a circle of pride and of people's feelings of self-confidence. And then this idea of the effect of pride and whether or not it is helping to build more virtuous citizens. And here, again, we have to be honest about how complex the relationship is. So I talked before about the strong correlations between people's levels of patriotism and certain virtuous behaviours and attitudes. But the reality is that when you control the other way around, there's also a correlation. And so, again, we think there is a kind of circular effect of pride. So it's true that people who are patriotic also are a lot more likely to volunteer more and more likely to have higher social capital, but both those things also then have a feedback effect in terms of their overall level of patriotism too. And so...
What do you mean by social capital?
And what I mean is their level of confidence, pride in their relationships outside of the home. Is that an acceptable response? We will no doubt, as you all rip me limb from limb at the end of it, we will no doubt return to issues such as that. We would argue it is a mechanism for virtue, but that it is linear, and it isn't linear, and it is complicated. And I've used the example that I was just speaking about. So volunteering does impact upon your level of patriotism, but patriotism impacts upon your level of volunteering too. That's not great, is it? Sorry. So I talked a bit about the kind of emerging behavioural psychology literature that's coming out of the US. And I've chosen an example here, which is so behavioural psychology research has used the Midas cohort study, so that's kind of 4,000 US citizens, to test the effect of civic pride on behaviour. And this is a kind of quote from their conclusions. They found that community pride is predictive of volunteering, and that of all of the things they tested, so they tested other kind of sentiments about people's place in the world, that it was the most important and it was unique in predicting volunteering. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say here is, although you can't prove on the basis of some regression analysis of some polling, much as think tanks would love to say you can prove that therefore this is the vital missing ingredient, so I can't prove from my research that patriotism makes people more likely to volunteer or more likely to trust. What I can show is that there's a very strong relationship between these things. But the work that is being done in terms of the genuinely academic and scientific world is becoming more and more sure and more certain that the relationship between external feelings of pride about your community and about your country, that there's a strong and causal relationship between that and how you behave and how you act. I said before that most of our work is kind of qualitative, and that's true, and so we ran lots of focus groups, we did lots of polling, and I think it's really important to confess something which sometimes politicians are not terribly good at confessing, which is that this idea of a link between patriotism and virtue is very intuitive for a lot of people. When we talk to people about whether or not people who are proud of their community behave in more positive ways, overwhelmingly people say that yes, they do. It's interesting that we also, for the slightly more glib part of this research, polled people on what made them proud of Britain, and we had a long list of institutions and individuals, everything from the monarchy to David Beckham, that had been filtered through our focus groups. And the highest scoring institution was the National Trust. It beat the Queen, the monarchy, it beat the Union Jack, it beat Parliament, it beat all kinds of slightly more obvious examples of what might make you proud of Britain. And we would argue that part of the reason for that is people's perception of the National Trust correlates quite strongly with what came across in the focus groups about people's perception of their sense of Britishness, which is that as a kind of a large voluntary organisation, as a membership organisation, as somewhere where you live history as modernity because you get to go and visit and look at lovely Regency rooms but then have a nice tea and a can of cake or whatever it is, that this really had strong affinity for people, and it was felt by people to be close to their notion of what it was about Britain that inspired pride in them. And it's interesting that in our focus group, certainly, one of the things that came across incredibly strongly, people talked about their distrust of the kind of American-style patriotism, the kind of flags on the lawn stuff David Cameron talks about sometimes. They talked about their slight amusement by the idea that things like democracy could be things that made you proud of Britain, and they were bemused by that because people associate emblems of patriotism very closely with something that's unique. So one person rather charmingly said in one of the focus groups, but the French have got a democracy too, so why would that make me proud of Britain? I think that's actually a fair point. We need to be identifying unique things. And the thing that people kept coming back to time and time again was an idea, justified or not, and some of the evidence suggests actually that it probably is fairly justified, that British people are more philanthropic, more likely to volunteer, more engaged, that there is something special about being British because British people do their bit. I think we might have a quote from one of the focus groups here, when this certainly is talking about the intuitive correlation in people's minds between pride and positive behaviours. And this person, yes, worried that people wouldn't fight for Britain like they once did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who, in terms of who's more likely to have these feelings and who is less likely. People who practice the faith are substantively more likely to feel patriotic about Britain. which I think is of interest perhaps to the theological side of today. People who say they're proud of their ethnicity are more likely to feel proud of Britain. Older people, that's probably fairly intuitive, are more likely, and people in employment. And so there is a strong relationship, not necessarily between socioeconomic status, but between activity and patriotism. And this brings us back, I think, to the circle that I was showing you before. People who have the opportunity to form strong social capital, to use a phrase that may not be entirely popular, to form strong social capital outside of the home are much more likely to feel patriotic. And so activity, in terms of employment, is much more important than socioeconomic status alone. Declining pride in Britain amongst white working class residents of England. The more socially isolated you are in terms of low quality social networks, etc., and we spoke about that, the less proud you are of the public person, or the less patriotic you are. And this speaks to some of the kind of broken window stuff, actually. I mean, that there is people who said that they were not proud of their house are really, really unlikely to feel patriotic about Britain, which is a kind of perverse relationship, right, from the incredibly micro to the incredibly macro, but nonetheless an incredibly strong relationship. And I think that this tells us something about the way in which people's personal experience of whether or not they're confident about their identity and who they are speak to their overall sense of their identity and Britishness. I mentioned two findings before that I think it's important to pull out, because I would like in the discussion, and I'm sure we will hear more about this later on having looked through the programme, this is something that we're going to do further work on, and my colleague Jonathan Beddoes just published a paper about faithful citizens, looking at, in particular, at people who are active within religious groups within the UK. But having a faith increased your likelihood of being a patriot, and all of the other kind of virtuous characteristics that we talked about, from volunteering to trust to openness, and that was no matter what that faith was. And I think that's an interesting, and for me it was slightly counterintuitive actually, because I would have assumed at the very least that while people of minority faiths would score very, very well around the kind of social capital, volunteering, all of those kind of, the relationship wouldn't be so clear with patriotism, and that was my prejudice, and it's one that's been disproved. But so I found that very interesting. And this is slightly more controversial and more difficult, and certainly more potentially dangerous as a way of talking about patriotism, because the circle of pride guff, where we talk, I had my arrows and we had civic pride, personal pride, etc. One of the public personal pieces of pride that is incredibly predictive of your level of patriotism and predictive of your likelihood to conform to these virtuous behaviours, it is your level of pride in your kind of ethnic identity. So black British respondents to our poll, for instance, those of them who said that they were proud to be black were much more likely to also be proud to be British. And I think that that's, again, for me, as somebody who perhaps has spent quite a lot of time talking about why multiculturalism as a frame, etc., is wrong and it fails to inspire bonding, etc., that's a challenging thing to learn. I'm going to finish by, because as I said, right, so we're not academics, we only do this stuff so that we can send it to politicians in the very vain hope that they will read it, and in the very vain hope that it will affect in some way, shape or form, however minute, their behaviour, their policies and their ideas. There are some opportunities for politicians within the current context. Virtue is becoming, I think, more and more acceptable as a way of talking in politics. It's not quite there yet, but you have John Cruddas, a man who is very, very interested in ideas and notions of virtue, now running the Labour Party's policy review. You have the work of Philip Blond in the Conservative Party. And the frame of virtue is important, because when we're talking about virtue, we can talk about a wider scope of behaviours and attitudes and ways of being than merely, wouldn't it be nice if people picked up more litter? Or wouldn't it be nice if people were a little bit nicer to each other? Which sometimes I think is one of the flaws in the big society narrative. It sounds grandiose and you boil it down, and actually what someone's saying is, I think there should be more scout leaders. So virtue allows us to have a slightly bigger frame for talking about that. And I think it's important then to start acknowledging some of the kind of sentimental mechanics behind that. And for us, patriotism is an important sentimental mechanic that drives virtue. And that's an opportunity for politicians, because patriotism, if done right in terms of rhetoric and engagement, is something that politicians can help to build. This is especially important in a period of austerity. The government's nudge unit, which was set up to think of ingenious ways of getting people to do good things, getting people to be virtuous, in fact. And they've come up with some ingenious solutions, like we're going to text message people and ask them whether they've done their recycling. But nonetheless, that was set up because of a recognition that there is not a huge amount of money to be used on kind of classic neoliberal triggers, right? So the normal way you do policy is you say, right, so we can give it a tax break, or right, so we can tax it, or right, so we can do a voucher. Those things are becoming less and less available to politicians and to policymakers, and for that reason, it's especially important for people to be looking at sentimental mechanics and how we can drive things forward. And coming out of that, although I'm going to explain some of the challenges for these things in a second, I mean, David Cameron has the big society, Ed Miliband talks about the good society. I'm not entirely clear what it is Nick Clegg talks about in terms of alarm clock society. But either way, to some extent, these are reflecting kind of wider emerging trends and patterns in terms of public opinion. So there is an emerging pattern in public opinion around people's perception that the state is at once overbearing and also doesn't do enough. So there's a kind of schizophrenia around what it is that the state does. This idea that I'm always being nannied, I'm always being bossed around, but this other idea on the other hand that the state never looks after me, it never does. And I think to some extent that schizophrenia emerges from exactly the kind of purely economic levers that I was mentioning before. So it springs from the idea that the state engages with you solely as an economic actor rather than as a human actor. And in a way, austerity provides an opportunity to make the state a little bit less kind of calculating and leverish in terms of how it deals with individuals and families, because those options aren't as available as they once were. And by engaging with some of the ideas behind their own rhetoric, politicians can start to access a way of talking about people's relationship with the state that is perhaps more human and more accessible. But there are challenges. Co-option causes toxicity. I haven't put the quote up because it's rude and I would have felt slightly embarrassed, but someone said this marvellous thing, and it did kind of respond, it reflected the feeling in lots of the focus groups about the big society narrative, which is, well, I've been volunteering for 20 years, but I don't want to be made to feel like now I'm volunteering so that I can conspire with the, insert rude word from your imagination, Conservative Party. And as a Conservative, obviously I kind of sat there and went slightly red, but nonetheless, that's a really important lesson for politicians, I think. It came through in all the polling and all the focus groups, etc. British people tend to regard voluntarism and social action, etc. as being things that are emblematic of Britain. It's our Blitz spirit, it's something that we do well. The moment that it appears like politicians either think they're inventing these things or think that they are, or claim them as belonging to them and their particular political ideology, people find that incredibly distasteful, and there is a danger, a real danger of turning people off to those things. So I think that we make some slightly vague, I suppose, recommendations in the pamphlet about how we should talk about volunteering, etc. But I suppose that for us, the core lesson from it is that politicians should refrain from trying to invest shared goods with an ideological edge, to the extent that sometimes the big society rhetoric was in danger of doing. 60% of people feel that patriotism is in decline. That's actually the lower figure. So that's people who believe that patriotism is in decline from just 25 years ago. When you ask them, you know, is patriotism in decline from 50 years ago, that goes up to, I think it's like 75–80%. So there is a feeling amongst people that pride in Britain is reducing over time. And that is something that I think, if we're going to take patriotism seriously as a means to achieving citizenship that is more open, more trusting, more self-reliant and voluntary and altruistic, then we're going to have to think very carefully about why that is and what it is that can be done to stem it. Hurt pride. so white British and English pride is under-engaged with. It's a well-worn cliche about the multiculturalism debate that it was actually incredibly successful for the people who took part, but that white British people didn't tend to take part and so therefore have felt excluded from it. I think there's a lot of sense in that. I also think that we have to think really carefully about how it is that we can encourage identification, self-identification in a way for white British people, in a way that isn't about the nastier connotations of BNP and xenophobia and racism, and is more akin to what has been successfully developed in terms of the black British community, the black Asian community, in terms of finding ways of talking about yourself and your multiple identities in a way that it makes sense, is clear, is proud and honest, but at the same time isn't purely exclusionary. And I think that that's going to be incredibly important. And the overwhelming thing, the only thing really I think that any politician should take away absolutely seriously from day one from this research is that the public are incredibly cynical about politicians who talk about patriotism as an argument. So when Gordon Brown gave his speech about Britishness and British jobs, British workers and such things, it was a good effort, bless him. It was an engagement with the idea of patriotism. But the thing, when we kind of showed people extracts from that speech, the thing that people kept picking up on time and time again is that he's talking about it on the basis that he loves Britain because we freed slaves, or because we have democracy for this long, or because... Whereas for the majority of people who do feel patriotic, whatever it's driven by in reality, whatever the kind of mechanics of it are in reality, their feeling about their own pride in Britain is that it's a natural thing, it's something that lives there at the back of their mind, not that it's the end of a rhetorical or logical process. And I think that when politicians start to talk about it, again it comes to this question of injecting the ideological into the shared, people are turned off by that, people feel very cynical about that. And I will end by quoting another person from one of our focus groups, who said a brilliant thing. She said, I don't love my son because he's got a first from Oxford. I love my son, and I'm proud of him because he's got a first from Oxford. And I think that's an important distinction that politicians all too often fail to make when they talk about patriotism. They talk about loving Britain because, whereas for other people, they love Britain and they're proud of this, this and this. Anyway, I thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry that I've managed to flood the stage with water and with glib think tankery, but I look forward to a discussion.